In 1923, a postman in rural Vermont delivered letters every single day to the same address, letters addressed to a man who'd been dead for 5 years. The woman writing them knew he was dead. She'd received the telegram, she'd attended the funeral, she'd accepted the folded flag. And yet, according to postal records preserved at the National Archives, she mailed 1,147 letters to her deceased husband between 1918 and 1931, an average of one every 3 days for 13 years. The postman delivered each one to her own mailbox. She paid full postage. The local postmaster, in correspondence discovered by historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell in 2018, noted that he was explicitly instructed by the widow not to intervene. She wasn't confused, she wasn't senile. She was 32 years old when it started. This isn't fiction. This is what happened when an entire generation of women lost the men they loved before they'd finished learning how to be married. What makes someone write to the dead? Not once in a moment of grief, not a letter tucked into a casket or burned in a ceremony, but daily, faithfully, for over a decade, writing to someone they know will never write back. It's a question that cuts to the heart of how humans cope with loss that arrives too soon, too violently, and with too little explanation. Because this woman wasn't alone. In the decades after World War I, postal workers across America, Britain and France reported the same phenomenon. Letters arriving at their offices addressed to soldiers whose deaths had been confirmed years earlier, written by wives and mothers and sisters who knew perfectly well they were writing to ghosts. What these letters reveal isn't madness. It's something far more complex about the particular kind of grief that war creates. A loss so abrupt, so distant, so divorced from the rituals that usually help humans process death, that the only way forward was to pretend, in private, that it hadn't happened at all. I'm curious. It's after midnight, isn't it? There's something about these late hours that makes us ready to sit with uncomfortable truths about the human heart. If this story resonates with you, leave a comment telling me what time you're watching this, and subscribe, because every week we're diving into the histories that reveal who we really are when everything familiar is stripped away. Now, let's step back in time. You're sitting at a kitchen table on an October evening in 1917. The lamplight flickers across the paper in front of you, and your hands smell like the potato soup you served for dinner. Your husband left 4 months ago. He's somewhere in France. You're not allowed to know where exactly. The letters he sends arrive in bunches, sometimes 3 in one day, then nothing for weeks. They've been opened by military censors. Entire paragraphs are blacked out. You've learned to read between the lines, to decode the forced cheerfulness, to listen for what he's not saying. Tonight, you're writing back. You tell him about the neighbour's cow that got loose, about your sister's new baby, about the frost that came early and killed the tomatoes. You write in a careful, steady hand, filling both sides of the paper because postage overseas is expensive and paper is growing scarce. You fold it, seal it, address it to Private James Morrison, American Expeditionary Forces, France. You'll walk it to the post office tomorrow, and then, in 6 weeks or so, he might read it. He might be sitting in a muddy trench. He might be on a brief rest behind the lines, or he might already be dead, and this letter will never reach him at all. But you don't know that yet. So you seal the envelope and you go to bed, and you trust that your words will find him wherever he is. This is how love worked during wartime. Through paper, through waiting, through the faith that words could bridge an ocean and a war. The year is 1914, and marriage in America looks nothing like it will 50 years later. Most women marry in their early 20s. They're expected to be virgins. Their education, if they have any beyond grade school, has prepared them primarily for domestic life. The wedding night is often their first real intimacy. And then, within a year or two, they're navigating pregnancy, childbirth, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a household running on whatever income their husband provides. Young married couples don't have decades to grow into each other. They're building their lives in real time, learning to be partners while also being parents, while also surviving economically. In rural areas, marriages are practical arrangements as much as romantic ones. You marry someone from your community, someone your family knows. Love is expected to develop over time through shared work and shared children. And then 1917 arrives. America enters the war. 4 million men are mobilized. Husbands who've been married less than 5 years, men barely out of their own adolescence, are pulled from farms and factories and sent to training camps, then to troop ships, then to France. Their wives, many of them still in their 20s, many of them with small children, are left behind to manage households and farms and businesses they were never trained to run alone. The government launches a campaign to encourage letter writing, keeping up morale, they call it. Wives are instructed to write cheerful letters. Don't burden him with your worries. Don't mention financial struggles. Don't tell him about sick children or failed crops or loneliness. Send him news from home, but make it pleasant. Make him want to come back. Make him feel like there's still a normal world waiting for him. So women write. They write letters that perform normalcy, that pretend everything is fine, that construct an imaginary domestic space where life continues unchanged, waiting for him to step back into it. These letters become their marriage, the only private space they have together, the only place where they can say, "I love you and I miss you and come home soon." The only place where they're still wife and husband instead of woman alone and soldier in danger. According to postal records analysed by Dr. Elizabeth Chen and published in her 2015 study, Epistolary Intimacy in Wartime, American wives sent an estimated 500 million letters to soldiers during World War I. The sheer volume overwhelmed postal systems. Ships crossing the Atlantic carried more letters than supplies in some months. The military established dedicated postal units. Censors worked around the clock, reading private correspondence, looking for anything that might compromise security. For the couples writing these letters, it was the only thread keeping their marriages alive. Many had been married less than a year when their husbands deployed. They were still strangers in many ways, still learning each other's habits and preferences and fears. And now they had to maintain that intimacy through words alone, words that would take weeks to arrive and weeks more to receive a response. Women developed routines. Writing time became sacred. Some wrote every evening after the children were asleep. Some wrote during lunch breaks at the factories where they now worked. They saved newspaper clippings to enclose. They pressed flowers. They tried to capture, on paper, what their lives felt like so their husbands wouldn't forget what they were fighting to return to. And in France, men carried these letters like talismans. Letters from home were read until they fell apart. Men slept with them inside their uniforms. According to memoirs collected by the Veterans History Project, soldiers would read their wives' letters aloud to each other in the trenches, sharing news from towns they'd never visited, creating a collective imagination of home that sustained them through conditions that would otherwise be unbearable. This is what made what happened next so particularly cruel. November 11th, 1918. The armistice is signed. The war is over. But 116,000 American soldiers are dead. Tens of thousands more are dying from influenza in military hospitals. And back in America, women wait for telegrams. The telegrams arrive at all hours. A knock on the door. An official envelope. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that Private James Morrison was killed in action in France. 30 words or fewer. No details. No explanation. Just the fact of death, delivered by a stranger, ending a life before the wife has even fully understood what her married life was supposed to be. Sarah Morrison was 27 years old when the telegram arrived. She'd been married for 19 months. Her husband had been in France for 14 of them. They'd spent 5 months together as husband and wife, 5 months of learning each other's bodies, each other's morning routines, each other's preferences for how strong the coffee should be. And now he was gone, killed in action, which could mean anything: shot by a sniper, blown apart by artillery, died of wounds over hours or days, buried in a grave she'd never visit in a country she'd never see. The telegram didn't say. The telegram never said. According to protocols outlined in military documents from the War Department, wives were sent a second telegram several weeks later with slightly more information: the date of death, sometimes the location. They were told that letters and personal effects would be returned when possible. That more information would follow as circumstances permit. Many wives never received those letters back. Many personal effects were lost or destroyed, and the bodies weren't coming home. Not yet. The military didn't have the resources to repatriate 116,000 dead soldiers, while also demobilizing 4 million living ones. The graves in France were marked, recorded, photographed, but the men stayed there. This created a particular kind of grief, documented extensively in letters to the War Department that were preserved at the National Archives and analysed by Dr. Mitchell. Women wrote asking for more details. How did he die? Did he suffer? Was anyone with him? Where exactly is he buried? Can I visit? Will you bring him home? The answers, when they came, were form letters, brief, bureaucratic, providing minimal information, expressing deepest sympathy, thanking them for their sacrifice. For women like Sarah Morrison, this meant there was no body, no funeral they could plan, no grave to tend, no moment of seeing the corpse that makes death real in a way that words never can. Just a telegram, a folded flag eventually delivered by mail, and then nothing. The marriage simply ended. The man they'd been writing to every day, maintaining intimacy with across an ocean, performing their role as wife for, he just disappeared. And the letters they'd been writing kept being written, because what else was there to do? The phenomenon didn't have a name at first. Postmasters in small towns started noticing letters arriving at their offices addressed to dead soldiers. They'd check their records. Yes, this man died in France. The widow was notified. They'd look at the return address. Yes, it's from the widow herself. They'd hold the letter, uncertain what to do with it. Some postmasters returned the letters marked deceased. Some delivered them to the widow's own mailbox, assuming she'd made an error. Some held them in dead letter storage, waiting for instructions that never came. But the letters kept coming, and when postmasters made discreet inquiries, stopping by the house, asking if the widow understood her husband was dead, they found that yes, she knew. She knew perfectly well. But she was writing to him anyway. Sarah Morrison's postmaster, a man named Henry Albright, kept meticulous records that provide extraordinary insight into this phenomenon. His correspondence, preserved at the Vermont Historical Society, reveals that by 1920 he was handling letters to dead soldiers from 3 different widows in his small town. He wrote to his regional supervisor asking for guidance. The supervisor wrote back with instructions to deliver the letters as addressed, which meant delivering them to the widow's own mailboxes. "These women have lost enough," the supervisor wrote. "If writing letters provides them comfort, we will not interfere. The Postal Service exists to deliver mail as addressed. Let them write." So Albright did. Every time Sarah Morrison mailed a letter to her dead husband, he delivered it back to her mailbox. Full postage paid. Official postal markings. Everything appeared normal except for the fundamental impossibility of what was happening. And Sarah Morrison wasn't unique. According to research compiled by Dr. Mitchell from postal records across 7 states, at least 400 documented cases existed of widows continuing to mail letters to deceased husbands for periods ranging from several months to over a decade. The practice was common enough that some post offices developed informal policies for handling it. The letters themselves, The few that have survived and been preserved in historical archives provide devastating insight into what these women were doing and why. They weren't confused. They weren't denying reality. The letters acknowledged death directly. "I know you're gone," Sarah Morrison wrote in a letter dated February 1919, preserved in her family's papers and now housed at the Vermont Historical Society. "I know you'll never read this, but I don't know how else to talk to you anymore." What these letters reveal is that writing had become the only way these women knew how to maintain their relationship with their husbands. For months or years, the marriage had existed primarily on paper. They'd written everything to each other, the mundane details of daily life, their fears and hopes, their love and longing. Writing was how they were intimate, how they shared their lives, how they stayed married despite being separated. And when death severed the relationship, the muscle memory of writing remained. The need to process daily life by narrating it to him. The habit of formulating observations as if explaining them in a letter. The ritual of sitting down in the evening and composing words meant for his eyes. Grief researchers now recognise this as a form of continuing bonds, the psychological process by which bereaved individuals maintain connection with the deceased. But in 1918, there was no therapeutic framework for understanding it. There was just women writing letters to ghosts and postmen uncertain whether to be concerned or compassionate. The content of these letters varied. Some were purely practical, updates about managing the farm, decisions about the house, questions about finances, as if he might somehow answer from beyond the grave. Some were intimate, confessions of loneliness, descriptions of dreams where he came home, admissions of anger at him for dying. Many letters talked to the dead husband about their own approaching death. Women who were struggling with illness or despair would write letters explaining that they'd be seeing him soon, that the separation was temporary, that death wasn't an ending, but a postponement of reunion. This is where the letters become most heartbreaking, because what they reveal isn't madness or pathology. It's the fundamental human need to believe that love persists beyond death, that the intimate connection formed through all those wartime letters couldn't simply evaporate because a body stopped functioning, that somehow, somewhere, he was still receiving her words. By the mid-1920s, American society was actively trying to move on from the war. The economy was booming, new social freedoms were emerging, young people were embracing jazz-age culture, dancing, drinking, pursuing pleasure as an antidote to the years of sacrifice and loss. The war generation was supposed to get over it, move forward, rebuild. But the widows couldn't move forward. They were trapped in a perpetual 1917, still writing to husbands frozen in time, still performing the role of wartime wife even though the war was over and the man was dead. Society had expectations for widows. There were rules about mourning periods, proper dress, acceptable behaviour. Young widows were expected to mourn properly for a year, then gradually resume normal life. Remarriage was acceptable after an appropriate interval. Moving on was not just permitted, but encouraged. But many war widows couldn't do it. The grief was too complicated, the loss too abrupt, the marriage too unfinished. According to census records analysed by historian Dr. Patricia Williams, war widows from WWI had significantly lower remarriage rates than other widows in the same time period, suggesting that something about wartime loss made it particularly difficult to form new attachments. The letter writing became a way of refusing to move on, of insisting that the relationship still mattered even though society wanted to relegate it to the past. Every stamp purchased, every envelope addressed, every letter mailed was an act of defiance against the pressure to forget and remarry and pretend the dead husband had just been a brief chapter in a longer story. Sarah Morrison never remarried. She lived until 1964, spending 46 years as a widow from a 19-month marriage. She stopped writing the letters in 1931, according to postal records, 13 years after her husband's death, but she kept every letter she'd written, storing them in a trunk in her attic. Her niece discovered them after Sarah's death and donated them to the Historical Society, where they remain today, war 547 letters to a dead man, offering an intimate window into grief that couldn't find resolution. Reading these letters now, nearly a century later, what emerges isn't the strangeness of writing to the dead. It's the aching normalcy of the impulse. Sarah, Morrison's letters are full of ordinary observations: the first snow, a recipe she tried, something amusing the neighbour said, the same content she'd written when he was alive, the same tone, the same attempts to maintain intimacy through shared observations about the world. The only difference is that now no response was coming, and she knew it, and she kept writing anyway. Other war widows found different ways to cope. Some threw themselves into memorial work, becoming active in organisations dedicated to preserving the memory of the fallen. Some remarried quickly, sometimes to other veterans, sometimes to men who hadn't served. Some struggled with depression and substance abuse, documented in medical records from veterans' hospitals that also treated soldiers' widows. But the letter writers, the women who maintained the epistolary relationship with the dead, they were enacting a particular kind of survival strategy. Writing provided structure, purpose, a way to process daily life, and perhaps most importantly, it allowed them to maintain the identity that wartime had created: the soldier's wife, faithful and waiting, keeping the home fires burning. Because what else was the alternative? To accept that the marriage had ended before it really began? To admit that those 5 months together were all she'd ever have? To stop being a wife and become simply a woman who'd been briefly married once, long ago, to a man almost no one remembered? The letters were a refusal of that erasure. Every time Sarah Morrison addressed an envelope to Private James Morrison, she was insisting that he had existed, that their marriage had been real, that love didn't expire just because a body did. The phenomenon largely disappeared after World War II, partly because casualty notification improved. Widows received more information, more support, more recognition. Partly because trauma psychology evolved, there were now frameworks for understanding grief and treating complicated bereavement. Partly because society became more mobile and anonymous, small-town postmasters no longer knew every widow personally and noticed their unusual mailing patterns. But mostly, it disappeared because the nature of war correspondence changed. By 2022, telephone calls were possible, however rare and expensive. By Vietnam, some soldiers had limited phone access. By the modern era, service members can video chat with spouses from combat zones, sending daily texts and emails and photos. The relationship isn't maintained primarily through letters anymore, so when death comes, the severing looks different. The women who wrote to dead husbands were the last generation to conduct marriages primarily on paper, to have intimacy mediated entirely through words that took weeks to arrive, to build their entire understanding of married life through the discipline of writing. Which means when the writing stopped, when death made it impossible, they had to invent a new way to continue, and what they invented was this: letters to nowhere, mailed to no one, connecting to the void, performing love, in the absence of any possibility of response. Was it healthy? Therapeutic? Pathological? Mental health professionals of the era debated this question extensively. Some viewed it as harmless fantasy that provided comfort. Others worried it prevented widows from processing grief and moving forward. Some postmasters reported being disturbed by it. Others found it touching, but the widows themselves rarely sought help or explanation. They simply wrote their letters, paid their postage, and continued their one-sided conversations with men who would never write back. Sarah Morrison's final letter, dated March 1931, is brief. "I think I'm finished now," she wrote to her long-dead husband. "I've told you everything I needed to tell you. I hope you heard some of it wherever you are. I hope you know I never stopped loving you. I hope 13 years of letters is enough to make up for the 40 years we should have had together." She folded the letter, sealed it, mailed it. The postman delivered it back to her mailbox one last time. She retrieved it and added it to the trunk with all the others. And then she stopped. She never explained why, never told anyone what changed, just quietly closed the chapter on a grief ritual that had structured her adult life for over a decade. What do we make of this now? In an era where we text constantly, where absence is measured in hours, not months, where relationships are documented in real time across social media, what can we possibly understand about the particular loneliness of the woman writing letters to a ghost? Maybe just this: that love, once established, doesn't simply evaporate when death intervenes, that humans will find ways to maintain connection even when connection is impossible. That sometimes the only way to survive devastating loss is to pretend in private that the loss hasn't entirely happened. That writing can be both a bridge to the absent and a container for grief that has nowhere else to go. The letters Sarah Morrison wrote are preserved now in climate-controlled archives, available to researchers by appointment. They're part of the historical record, primary source documents about grief and war and gender and marriage in early 20th century America. Historians cite them in academic papers. Students read excerpts in classes on World War I or women's history or the evolution of American mourning practices. But they weren't written for posterity. They were written for an audience of one, a man who died in France in 1918, a husband barely known. They were written in the faith that somehow, impossibly, the words might reach him. That love could transcend death if you just kept writing. Whether that faith was justified, we'll never know. But what we do know is that Sarah Morrison wrote 1,147 letters across 13 years, and in doing so, kept a marriage alive long after death should have ended it, kept a connection burning long after the war extinguished it, kept talking to someone who couldn't answer, because silence was more unbearable than the certainty of writing to nothing. And maybe that's not madness. Maybe that's just love, refusing to accept the limits of mortality. Maybe that's what humans do when loss arrives too soon and too violently. We find ways, however strange, to hold on just a little longer, to say just one more thing, to send just one more letter into the void, hoping against hope that somehow, somewhere, someone is listening. Thank you for staying with this story tonight. These late hours when we're willing to sit with difficult truths, that's when history stops being facts and dates and becomes something more human, something that helps us understand what people do when everything familiar is stripped away. If this resonated, leave a comment, share it with someone who appreciates these kinds of stories, and I'll see you next time when we'll explore another forgotten corner of the past that reveals something essential about who we are.